My beloved child, listen carefully, because what I am about to tell you may change the way you look at someone in your own family. There are moments in life when you can feel that something is missing from a story. Not because someone has openly told you that they are hiding something. Not because you have proof, but because certain pieces simply never fit together. A conversation suddenly stops when you enter the room. Someone changes the subject when a particular name is mentioned. You remember asking a question years ago, but the answer you received never really satisfied you. And maybe you told yourself, it's probably nothing. Maybe you even laughed it off. Maybe you decided that some family things were better left alone. But deep down, a small question remained. What if there is more to the story? And my child, that is where this message begins. Not with fear, not with suspicion, and certainly not with an invitation to accuse anyone. It begins with something much quieter, the possibility that there are parts of your family story you have never been given the chance to understand. This is why the title of this message matters. A hidden family truth may soon come to light, and notice the wording. It is not saying that you should immediately assume the worst about your family. It is not telling you to confront someone tonight. It is telling you to prepare your heart for clarity. Because sometimes the truth does not arrive with an explosion. Sometimes it arrives through one sentence, one conversation, one unexpected confession, one old photograph, one message, one person finally deciding that they are tired of carrying something alone. And sometimes the most shocking part is not the truth itself. It is discovering why nobody told you before. That is the part I want you to stay with me for. Because there is a possibility that the person who has been holding this information may not be the person you have been imagining. And that changes everything. You may have already formed an opinion about who knows something. You may have thought, it has to be that person. But what if you are looking in the wrong direction? What if the person closest to the truth is someone you never considered? Take a breath and think about that for a moment. Have you ever had a family situation where you could tell there was history behind it, but nobody wanted to explain? Maybe there was an old disagreement. Maybe two relatives stopped speaking. Maybe someone left and nobody ever gave you the complete reason. Maybe there was a story from your childhood that was always told differently depending on who was speaking. And perhaps you learned to stop asking, but stopping the question does not always remove the question. Sometimes it simply pushes it deeper, and years later, something happens that brings it back. A name appears. Someone reaches out. An old memory suddenly makes sense. Or a person who has been quiet for years finally speaks. That is why I want you to listen to this message without trying to force an answer. You do not need to decide who is guilty. You do not need to decide who is lying. You do not need to create a story before the facts become clear. Just listen. Because clarity has a different feeling from suspicion. Suspicion makes you restless. Clarity makes you still. And if this message is touching something you have quietly wondered about for years, you can tell me in the comments. Have you ever felt that there was a missing piece in your family story? You do not have to share anything private. Just tell me whether you have ever had that feeling. Because there is something else you need to understand. Not every hidden thing is hidden because someone wanted to hurt you. Sometimes people hide things because they are ashamed. Sometimes because they are afraid. Sometimes because they believe they are protecting a child. Sometimes because they do not know how to explain something that happened long before you were old enough to understand it. And sometimes people remain silent because telling the truth would force them to face their own past. That is why this message is not about creating fear. It is about becoming emotionally ready for information that may change your perspective. Because when the truth finally becomes visible, you may realize that the question was never simply, what happened? The deeper question was, why was I never told? And my beloved child, there may be a reason that question is becoming louder now. Something may be shifting. Something that once seemed permanently buried may no longer be staying buried. And before we talk about what that shift could mean, there is one part of your past you need to look at differently. Because the signs may not have started today. They may have been there much earlier than you realized. Think about the strange moments you once dismissed. A relative becoming unusually quiet around a certain subject. Someone refusing to answer a simple question. A family tradition that never had a clear explanation. An old relationship that ended without anyone telling you the real reason. A photograph that disappeared. A box of letters nobody wanted to open. A name you heard once and never heard again. These things can stay in the back of your mind for years. And then one day, something happens. You hear the same name again. You meet someone who reminds you of an old story. You discover a detail that contradicts something you were told. And suddenly your mind goes back. Wait. Why does this sound familiar? That moment can be powerful. But it can also be dangerous if you immediately fill the missing pieces with assumptions. So hear me carefully. A mystery is not proof of betrayal. A silence is not automatically proof of deception. And a strange feeling is not the same thing as evidence. What it can be, however, is an invitation to pay attention. Because there are times when you are finally mature enough to understand something that would have been too complicated for you years ago. Think about how many things you understand now that made absolutely no sense when you were younger. Maybe you misunderstood a parent. Maybe you misunderstood why someone left. Maybe you misunderstood why a certain relative acted the way they did. Maybe you thought someone was simply cold, distant, or difficult. Then you grew older. You learned more about life. You learned about fear. You learned about grief. You learned about mistakes. You learned that adults sometimes make decisions while carrying pain they never talk about. And suddenly, an old memory can look completely different. That is why timing matters. Sometimes information becomes meaningful only when you are ready to process it. And perhaps that is one reason this message found you at this particular moment. Not because you are guaranteed to discover some dramatic secret tomorrow, but because you may be entering a season where you are finally willing to see your family history without the emotional filter you had when you were younger. That is a very different kind of revelation. It is not always about discovering that somebody was bad. Sometimes it is discovering that everybody involved was human, messy, afraid, hurting, trying to survive something they did not know how to explain. And then comes the part nobody expects. Sometimes the person you thought was protecting the family was actually protecting themselves. And sometimes the person you thought was responsible for the silence was not the person who started it. Let that sink in. You may have been judging the last person who carried the secret, while the original story began somewhere else entirely. That possibility alone can change how you look at everything. Maybe the person who stayed silent did not create the situation. Maybe they inherited it. Maybe they were told not to speak. Maybe they thought they were doing the right thing. Maybe they were simply afraid of what would happen if the truth came out. And now, years later, circumstances have changed. People have changed. You have changed, and the thing that once seemed impossible to discuss may no longer have the same power over everyone. That is when hidden stories often begin to surface. Not because someone suddenly becomes fearless, but because silence becomes heavier than honesty. There is another possibility you should consider. The revelation may not come from the person you expect. It may come indirectly. You may hear something from a cousin. You may see something in an old document. You may have a conversation with someone who assumes you already know. And suddenly you realize there was a whole part of the story that nobody ever explained to you. That kind of moment can be emotional. You might feel angry. You might feel relieved. You might even laugh because you cannot believe you spent years wondering about something that finally has an explanation. And all of those reactions are human. You do not have to immediately know how you feel. If you have experienced a moment where something from your past suddenly made sense years later, tell me about it in the comments. Only if you are comfortable. Sometimes those moments teach us more than we realize. But there is still one question. Why now? Why would something that stayed quiet for years suddenly begin moving toward the surface? And this is where the deeper part of the message begins. Because Sometimes the change is not happening inside the secret. The change is happening inside you. You are no longer the same person who heard that story as a child. You have lived. You have lost people. You have experienced disappointment. You have learned to recognize patterns. You have developed your own voice. And perhaps you are finally strong enough to hear something without allowing it to destroy your peace. That matters, because the truth is only truly liberating when you are ready to carry it without allowing it to control you. And my child, there is one more layer to this. The hidden truth may not only explain something about your family, it may explain something about you. There is something fascinating about family history. You inherit more than names and photographs. You inherit stories. You inherit patterns. You inherit beliefs about love, trust, money, success, forgiveness, conflict, and even what you are allowed to become. Sometimes someone in a family says, "That is just how our family is," and everyone accepts it. But what if it was never supposed to define you? What if a pattern continued simply because nobody stopped long enough to question where it began? This is where the hidden truth can take on a deeper meaning. Maybe what comes to light is not just a piece of information. Maybe it gives you context. Maybe it explains why certain relationships have always felt complicated. Maybe it explains why one person carries resentment. Maybe it explains why another person became overly protective. Maybe it explains why certain subjects were treated like forbidden territory. And suddenly, you begin to see something. The family was not necessarily divided because of what you were told. There may have been an older wound underneath it, an old decision, an old misunderstanding, an old betrayal, an old fear, or simply an event that was never properly talked about. And here is where I want you to be careful. Do not turn this message into a reason to investigate everybody around you. Do not go looking for enemies. Do not accuse someone because a sentence in this video reminded you of them. The purpose of revelation is not paranoia. The purpose of revelation is clarity. If something truly needs to come to light, let it come through real conversations, real evidence, and real circumstances. You do not have to force it. You do not have to chase it. You do not have to create it. Let the truth reveal itself naturally. And if you believe God is guiding you through this season, then ask for wisdom before you ask for answers. Because sometimes, the answer you desperately want is not the answer you are emotionally prepared to receive. And that may be why the timing matters so much. Maybe you have been asking, why did they do this? But perhaps the better question is, what do I need to understand so I do not carry this pattern into my own future? That question changes everything. Because imagine discovering something painful about your family, and then realizing you do not have to repeat it. You can stop the cycle. You can choose honesty where there was silence. You can choose communication where there was avoidance. You can choose forgiveness without pretending that something never happened. You can establish boundaries without carrying hatred. You can love people while still refusing to repeat their mistakes. That is a powerful kind of freedom. And perhaps this is why the title says, "A hidden family truth is about to be revealed." Not simply because information is coming, but because you may finally be able to see what that information means. There is a difference. A child can hear a family story and only remember the surface. An adult can hear the same story and understand the pain underneath it. That is growth. And maybe you have been growing quietly for longer than you realized. Think about the last few months. Have you noticed yourself becoming less interested in drama? Have you become more protective of your peace? Have you stopped needing everyone to approve of your decisions? Have you started questioning old beliefs? Have you felt drawn toward understanding rather than simply reacting? If so, that may be more important than any external sign. Because it means you are changing the way you process information. And when your perspective changes, old stories can suddenly reveal new meanings. There may also be a person in your family who has been carrying something alone. Someone who looks fine on the outside. Someone who rarely talks about the past. Someone who always changes the subject. Someone who seems emotionally distant. And perhaps you have judged them for that. But what if their silence is connected to something they have never known how to say? Again, this does not mean you should excuse harmful behavior. It simply means that understanding the story can help you respond wisely. And this is where Archangel Michael, in the spiritual symbolism of this message, represents something powerful. Courage to face what is hidden without becoming consumed by it. Protection does not always mean keeping every uncomfortable truth away from you. Sometimes protection means giving you the strength to face reality without losing yourself. That is the shift. You are not being asked to become obsessed with the past. You are being invited to become free from the past. And there is one final piece, one possibility that can completely change the way you interpret this entire message. The truth you have been waiting for may not arrive in the form you imagined. It may not be dramatic. It may not be a shocking confession. It may simply be a conversation that finally gives you enough information to understand why things happened the way they did. And when that happens, you may realize something unexpected. The truth was never meant to destroy your peace. It was meant to give you back a piece of it. Part 4. When the truth finally becomes clear, my beloved child, if there is one thing I want you to remember from this entire message, it is this. Do not be afraid of clarity. You may be afraid of what you will discover. That is understandable. You may be afraid that someone you trusted will disappoint you. You may be afraid that an old family story will change the way you see your childhood. You may be afraid that something you believed for years was incomplete. But clarity does not always take something away. Sometimes clarity gives something back. It gives you context. It gives you language for something you could never explain. It gives you permission to stop blaming yourself. It gives you the ability to understand where a pattern began. And most importantly, it gives you a choice. Because once you see a pattern, you can decide whether you want to continue it. That is where your power begins. Maybe the hidden truth is about an old relationship. Maybe it is about something that happened before you were born. Maybe it is about why two people in your family stopped speaking. Maybe it is about a decision that changed the direction of the family. Maybe it is something much smaller than that. The important thing is not to invent the answer before the truth arrives. Let reality speak for itself. If a conversation happens, listen. If someone opens up, do not interrupt just because the information is uncomfortable. If you discover something unexpected, take time before reacting. And if the truth hurts, give yourself permission to process it. You do not have to make a life-changing decision in the same hour that you learn something important. You can breathe, you can pray, you can reflect, you can talk to someone you genuinely trust, and you can decide what this information means for your future. Because the most beautiful outcome of revelation is not revenge, it is freedom. You may discover that someone made a terrible mistake. You may discover that someone was protecting themselves. You may discover that you were never the reason a family relationship became complicated. You may discover that a person you misunderstood was carrying a burden you knew nothing about. Or you may discover that a boundary you have been afraid to set is actually necessary. Whatever the truth is, let it teach you something. Do not allow someone else's hidden chapter to become the author of your entire life. That is the part I really want you to hear. Your family's history can explain you without having to define you. You can come from a complicated story and still create a peaceful future. You can acknowledge what happened without living inside it. You can forgive without reopening every door. You can love without accepting everything. You can walk away without hatred, and you can move forward without needing every person involved to agree with your version of the past. Maybe that is the revelation you are actually waiting for. Not simply, what did they hide from me? But who am I going to become now that I understand more? That is a much bigger question, and perhaps this is why you are hearing this message now. Maybe you have spent too much time trying to understand people who never explained themselves. Maybe you have spent too much energy trying to make an old situation make sense. Maybe you have carried guilt that was never yours. Maybe you have wondered whether you were somehow responsible for keeping everyone together. You are not responsible for carrying an entire family's unresolved history on your shoulders. You can respect your family without becoming responsible for every decision they made. You can honor your past without remaining trapped inside it. And if something truly needs to be revealed, let it be revealed in a way that brings understanding, not unnecessary destruction. That is the difference between revelation and chaos. So if a conversation comes, be calm. If an old truth surfaces, listen. If someone finally tells you something they have been afraid to say, give yourself time to process it. And if you discover that the truth is different from what you expected, remember that you do not have to decide everything immediately. Sometimes the first reaction is emotional. The deeper understanding comes later. And maybe, months from now, you will look back at this season and realize that what initially felt frightening actually gave you something you desperately needed. Perspective, peace, a clearer boundary, a healthier relationship, or simply the freedom to stop asking the same question over and over again. If this message connected with something you have been carrying quietly, you can leave a simple comment. I choose clarity over fear. Not because you know exactly what is coming, but because you are choosing to meet whatever comes with wisdom instead of panic. And if you have been waiting for a family conversation that you feel may finally happen, you do not need to explain the whole situation.
Jay,